Hello, my name is Joshua Caravilla, and I've spent this past year as a part of Glenbrook South's science independent research study investigating whether an individual's compassionate response could be affected after viewing a visual stimulus. I would first like to take this moment to thank Mrs. Laura Elgis for her continued support and guidance throughout the duration of this project. Also, I would like to thank Mr. Jeffrey Rylander and the entire GBS Science Department for making the SIRS opportunity available. Lastly, I'd like to thank all those who participated in my study, making this study possible. I'd like to begin by highlighting the distinction between compassion and empathy. However, the concepts are related. Empathy by itself means being able to visualize oneself in another situation and feel accordingly. It is defined by researchers as the visceral or emotional experience of another person's feelings. Compassion includes the previous statement, however, it is followed up with action. Researchers define compassion as the emotional response when perceiving suffering and involves an authentic desire to help. When looking at how to judge and define empathy, some scientists have concluded that there are five key areas to look at: recognizing suffering, tolerating uncomfortable feelings, understanding the universality of suffering, feeling for a person suffering, and a motivation to act. This discussion surrounding which angles to view and judge compassion has not been settled, however. This graphic right here does a really nice job of highlighting the distinctions and progression between pity, sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Within compassionate response, the term response leads to the question of whether compassion is inherently present and unconscious within everyone or if it is learned. Jean Desetti at the University of Chicago even found that rats can empathize with each other and will go out of their way to help one another if a other rat is in suffering. The idea that compassion is inherent and within every person is an important point to address, as any study cannot be conducted effectively if only a small portion of the sample has the learned ability of compassion. Once establishing that everyone contains compassion in some capacity, one must look at whether it is possible or not to influence it in any way. If compassion is a fixed set within every person, any study analyzing the effect of a stimulus on compassion will have no conclusive results, as compassion can't be increased or decreased to begin with. Psychologist Jack Nishke from the University of Wisconsin ran an experiment where he showed mothers pictures of their babies. He followed this up by showing them pictures of other babies, and the subjects responded by displaying more compassion. Nishke's study shows that one's potential influence on people's compassion is being presented with images of people with whom they share a familial connection. Another University of Wisconsin-Madison study led by Helen Wang has shown further proof that compassion can be learned or developed. The study began with the researchers training the participants in a Buddhist meditation technique. Following this, participants progressed from attempting to feel empathy for a loved one to themselves to finally someone they had some conflict with. The conclusion of this specific research was that Wang described compassion as being similar to a muscle, and the more that one used that muscle, the stronger it became. In the following study, Joshua Green and Jonathan Cohen from Princeton University explored the results when subjects were asked to contemplate a scenario where someone else was getting hurt. Receiving similar results, they found that the same neurological response was triggered as in the other study, further solidifying the claim that there are legitimate processes that the brain goes through when it encounters situations that require emotion and compassion. Looking at previous studies that were done on similar topics, a research paper completed by a University of Pennsylvania graduate student, Xiao Xiao Zhao, and it was their dissertation paper. Their specific inquiry looked to analyze whether the proximity of an individual to the study had many more different layers to the survey, analyzing if the image had an effect, proximity to the victim, and if having images of domestic violence or child had any impact on the inclination of the participants to engage with some form of intervention. Regarding proximity, the author of the study chose to use distant states as to avoid confounding variables such as nationality or cultural proximity. One thing to note is that the victims who were described and depicted in the pictures were white or Hispanic. This lack of racial diversity may have had some impact on the results of the study, as participants may have unconsciously exhibited a partial bias towards one racial group. This study analyzed the effect of the variables by using a control group that wasn't subject to any of the treatments, having a picture, knowing the story, etc., and were asked a series of questions on how likely they would intervene in certain situations, and how much money they would be willing to donate to an organization involved with solving the problem. These answers were then compared to the responses of the participants who had undergone the treatment in some manner. My goal was to figure out whether a visual stimulus could impact a person's compassionate response. I hypothesized that when the participants were exposed to the stimulus, there'd be minimal, if any, increase in the compassionate response exhibited by the participants. The results were obtained by utilizing various science clubs within the school. I reached out to the leaders and or sponsors of clubs like Medical Chapter, Science Olympiad, etc., who set up times that I could come in and carry out my experiment. In these various locations, I would have small numbered slips of paper that I would pass out to all the club members as a way to ensure anonymity while also being able to carry out a matched pairs experiment. The random number would be used to identify each individual's pre and post response so an accurate difference could be calculated. At the end of the preliminary questionnaire, there was a question asking if each individual participant consented to being a part of this experiment and viewing the stimulus that consisted of images and videos. They then would review the stimulus and complete the post test, which was the same test to gauge whether or not there was a change. On the right is a section of the raw data that was collected, showing some of the questions that were asked and the variety of responses that were provided. Here we have a scatter plot, with each plot point representing a participant. The points were created by finding the difference between the pre and post test scores, which was done in a couple of steps. First, participants completed a 21 question preliminary test where their baseline was calculated by averaging their responses to the questions on a 1 to 7 scale based on their agreement with a given statement, where 7 meant the statement was an accurate representation of their views, and 1 meant that the statement did not describe their views at all. Here, the maximum possible average score was a 7 and the lowest possible score was a 1. After completing all the above steps, each participant was ready to move on to the next step. In the graph, you can see that the axis ranges from -1 to 2, but in actuality, the maximum difference would be from -6 to 6, so this is just a zoomed in version of the actual graph. In graph 2, we have a breakdown of the responses and whether the change between the initial and post test was positive, negative, or negligible to a point where one could say that there was no real change. In the graph, we can see that 36 out of the 45 participants exhibited some sort of increase compared to the 8 out of 45 participants who experienced a negative change and the singular participant who experienced no change. The vast majority of participants, 80% of them, experienced an increase in their compassionate response. Graph 3 can be seen as an extension of Graph 1, as it converts the raw difference between the pre and post tests and converts the change into a percentage. Viewing the data in this way allows viewers of this graph to contextualize the change as an increase of 1 for an individual who started with the baseline average of 6 would be graphed very differently in this graph as opposed to an individual who started with the baseline average of 1 and increased 2 points. For this particular study to be carried out, I needed to be directing the flow of the study and therefore could not send out the visual stimulus through email or some other medium and hope that the conditions would be controlled in a way that I wanted them to be. However, this restriction caused new problems as Glenbrook South High School closed during the time period that additional samples were scheduled to be collected. This disruption reduced the total number of participants whose data could be collected and analyzed. Due to sampling variability, this reduced sample size could provide data that is not representative of the entire population and therefore not entirely valuable to generalize for the entire population. There is a slight positive trend in the difference between initial score and secondary score. This leads one to conclude that a short visual stimulus composed of positive images has an impact, albeit small, on a person's capacity for compassion. The results surpass the initial expectations and the hypothesis, as the hypothesis predicted a negligible increase, but an increase can clearly be seen. In the future, additional variables should be considered with this research topic to see whether or not they have an effect on the compassionate response. While one of the studies described already considered compassion within women after looking at babies, blocking for gender or age, or even adjusting the length of the stimulus could be interesting future experiments. Additionally, this experiment was carried out with the participants looking at the stimulus at one period of time. It would be interesting to see whether repeated exposure to the stimulus has any effect and when the increasing compassionate response flattens. Finally, it would be useful to see where the results of the study could be applied. Increasing compassionate response in a short period of time is extremely valuable and finding the right setting to utilize this tool would be beneficial. Thank you for watching my presentation, and here are my works cited.